Hi, welcome everybody to my talk, APTs Go Teleworking. First of all, usual disclaimer, we do a lot of casework, so the work that I'm representing here is the work from many helping hands, incident response consultants, threat intel analysts, and malware reverse engineering. It's kind of the collective of all the casework we've been doing for our customers. Few words about myself. Bart, based near Brussels in Belgium, doing incident response for a living for Mandiant, and actually started my career in the early 2000s. So when you had a computer security problem in the 90s, in the previous century, typically a network firewall was the solution. And so that's also where I started my career, deploying network firewalls and VPN devices. But I'm focusing on digital forensics and more recently on incident response since 2005. First of all, to kind of start with a little bit of a controversy, is when we're talking about VPN compromises, people immediately jump to conclusions and would start to associate this with this global pandemic, right? Where we all started using VPN appliances for teleworking. Now, we've been tracking this for a while now across multiple vendors and all the CVEs that have been affecting these vendors. And when these CVEs have been exploited in the wild. And so when we were tracking this over the last 2.5 years, we've seen actually no noticeable increase or misuse of these CVEs when we align this in a timeline that you see on the right-hand side. This talk focuses on the Pulse Secure intrusions we've observed with these CVEs. But we also had previous incidents where affecting Citrix NetScaler or Cisco devices. You remember also VPN filter, even predating in 2018. So the bottom line basically is that the VPN intrusions, the VPN device intrusions, provide a foothold within an environment, provide a pivot point, bypassing often other technology like network firewalls. And therefore, it's an interesting attack factor. And whether we've been all affected by this global pandemic doesn't change too much about that. As I've said, the talk focuses on one particular piece of technology from called Pulse Secure. Now, Pulse Secure started its history as Neoteris, then moved over to NetScreen, and then afterwards to Juniper. And more recently, end of last year, has been acquired by a company called Ivanti. And so they've changed a little bit the market by not providing IPsec tunnel-based VPNs to clients, but introducing this concept of SSL VPN, right? Where you basically have, in the case of Pulse Secure, a Linux-based web server that provides you with a TLS session, and that can use that TLS session to encrypt data back and forward, including tunneling packets from your laptop, mobile device, or whatever have you. And they have a pretty flexible solution. By then using the VPN device, they can assess the posture of your device, the location of your device, which IP address you're connecting from. And so it's often integrated with services like Active Directory or radio servers or LDAP servers to perform a secondary authentication, right? So your username and typically a token-based authentication that you have. We've been called in to investigate some of the intrusions that our customers have been facing with. And obviously, when we did our traditional incident response, we saw things that were abnormal in their environment, like attackers leaving traces in the event logs. And when we were tracing back these traces in the event logs, we were pointing back to these led to the discovery of the IP addresses that were behind a VPN appliance. Or in some cases, workstation names that were different than the ones that we've observed in the environment. And again, tracing back to the VPN devices. Sometimes also clearly malicious activity like dumping LSAS memory or starting Mimikatz, but then starting Mimikatz from a remote desktop client mapped drive, and then using the executables from their client computer, and therefore leaving as little traces as possible in the victim environment. So, kind of summarizing, we clearly were dealing with an attacker in those environments. Even some cases trying to exfiltrate data out of those environments, but couldn't figure really out where they were coming from. I mean, obviously, were these the first things that we thought was this must have been VPN devices, the client computers that actually have been compromised. And this, of course, would have been our first theory. But it turned out, as you will see over the next slides, that the attackers gained a foothold not on the client, but on the actual appliance itself that served as a entry point within those networks. So that's also what we disclosed earlier this year. In March, Pulse Secure came out with a integrity tool as a response on some of the intrusions observed, and this allowed many customers to match the files known and expected on the file system to a known good list. And this led in some of these cases to the discovery of these modifications on the file system itself. And that's when we were being called in and also helping out customers. And also during those investigations, we've identified a zero-day attack together with the vendor that allowed even more recent versions of the Pulse Secure to allow that initial attack vector and that initial foothold on those VPN appliances, therefore allowing the attacker remotely to execute commands on these VPN appliances itself. When we first started to report about this, we had some exposure on the 20th of April, but then more and more companies became aware about this. More organizations became aware about this, also here in Europe, and therefore started to run these integrity checker tools on their own Pulse Secure appliances. And therefore, we did a follow-up blog on May 27, which kind of also diversified our view, right? We've identified additional malware in use, additional 4 families, and also additional victims. And there were kind of interesting changes to the activity that we've been investigating. Kind of giving an overview of the malware we have observed from the totality of malicious activity. Again, not all of those are associated to the same clusters of threat activity, and we'll dive deeper into this. First of all, a lot of web shell activity, where the attackers were modifying the existing Pulse Secure CGI scripts and then adding routines to them, therefore allowing them to execute commands or upload and download files, in some cases also using encryption. Other than that, and I'll do a deep dive on this, modifying the upgrade routines so that even if you would upgrade the appliance itself, it would still have a persistent web shell on that system. So basically, you would have a new system image, but then you would have your web shell being transported with each and every upgrade that you're executing. Kind of interesting techniques, certainly with VPNs. Multi-factor authentication is luckily a very good security measure, but we've seen the attackers developing malware and a couple of multiple variants called slow pulse to bypass those multi-factor authentications, or sometimes collect those credentials with malware like Bloodbank or Bloodmine, and to write them to files which then afterwards could be collected by some of the existing web shells. I'll do a deep dive on the Antiforensics, the stealthy techniques that the attackers were using to stay under the radar, not only in the victim networks, but also on the victim appliances. Obviously, to remain and gain that foothold within those victim environments for as long as possible. or in some cases, changing the cryptographic libraries like the OpenSSL libraries and this is a different cluster that we're tracking. Kind of an overview of the two biggest clusters of activity we've observed, UNC 2630. Again, that was the first cluster of activity that we've reported on, predominantly focusing on victims targeting in the defense industrial base located in the United States, and also the widest variety of malware. Now, one of those malware, as I have explained, is kind of targeting the upgrade routines. As I've said before, when you upgrade your appliance, you have a script that is running on the Pulse Secure itself to unpack all the new files that have been modified by the vendor. But in this upgrade routine, in this upgrade script, the attackers actually made a modification so that it would write a web shell to a specific location, a specific CGI file on disk that would then be remotely accessed by the attackers. And therefore, each time they provided, in this case, the parameter ID, would execute a system command on the operating system itself, which they then can use again to deploy or redeploy their malware on that target system. As I've mentioned before, another malware family, which I think had some pretty novel techniques, called slow pulse, allowing to override the existing routines on the Pulse Secure device. And in the case that is shown over here on the right, in case the attacker provided a known backdoor password in its authentication, it would always be a valid authentication, and therefore able to bypass any authentications checks that would be performed by the system or radius server or token-based server that you have in your network. A separate cluster of activity that we're tracking as 2717, using the same CVE as a 0-day to get the initial foothold, but different victims, and also victims located within Europe. So this threat actor cluster of activity that we've observed was using somewhat differently malware, but kind of same coding style. So we've associated that there's some sort of collaboration between the two entities. One of the malware clusters that I'm going to highlight here is one of the credential harvesting tools that they're using called Pulse Jump. And so basically also again modifying the existing scripts on the Pulse Secure appliance. So therefore to write with each authentication in a file in the TMP directory, the authentications that are happening, and again exposing them to the attacker as they can then collect those files using the existing web shells on the system. Now let's talk about the Antiforensics. And as an incident response company, we were faced with this attacker that really remained wanted to remain as stealthy as possible. And so we were using a couple of techniques like time stomping on the VPN appliances themselves to kind of blend in to the time frame of activity that you would typically see on those systems. For example, when you have a system upgrade, you would kind of blast and make a lot of modifications to the file system itself. So obviously, if you have a web shell on that same system, planted by the attacker by misusing one of these CVEs, it would fall outside of those time frames. So the attackers were well aware, and then in some cases performed time stomping so that it would align with system upgrades. In other cases, like the exploitation of the 0-day, as I've mentioned, they were well aware that in some cases these also triggered core dumps. And so again, removing those files is some of the techniques that we've investigated. More simple examples, suppressing certain log entries or simply removing them by using malware like Tinblood, or more advanced techniques like having binaries on the system itself, in the example over here, using clean Pulse. So therefore patching the logging processes on the system itself, so that therefore these would no longer log to disk any activity that is happening. Lastly, interesting enough, we've seen during those disclosures that the attackers were quite well aware of what was happening and what was being disclosed. And in some cases, we've seen the attackers going back to their victim environments and deleting the files on those VPN appliances. That so obviously in an effort to clean up any of the malware they have left behind. Doing some anti-forensics, or some would just call it forensics. The techniques that we've used at Mandiant is obviously using those integrity checkers for those initial leads, right? So if you find a file that has been modified, obviously that's your first starting point to then do further analysis. As I've mentioned, the attacker was well aware about the logging mechanisms available on the system. And so therefore looking at different sources of logging, like a SIEM system or off-box system that you have, like a syslog server, was really helpful to perform those analyses. Because the attacker could modify the logs on the box, it would be mostly difficult for them to target the logs that are stored off the box. Using traditional techniques like timeline analysis helped us to identify those malicious files on those systems. But as I've mentioned, some cases we were also faced with time stomping taking place. What was interesting is that the Pulse Secure appliances also provided and mounted some of the file systems as read-only, right? So in an effort to make it harder to make any changes. We saw that the attacker remounted those partitions in order to write files to them. But again, that also left traces, because you would see changes to those file systems that you would normally not observe. And again, that was a pivot point in order to investigate those changes that happened around that time. Lastly, other techniques like file carving for anything deleted on disk, but that still may be recoverable. Or, as I've mentioned, with the use of Atrium, sometimes we would just have a web shell with a later version of a compromised device, but actually performing a rollback to a previous version would then allow us to recover the malware that affected an initial intrusion. So kind of to summarize all of the different techniques that we've observed with the attackers, something I haven't talked about before is even before the attackers were targeting these VPN appliances, they were using exit nodes from what looked like to be a wide compromised network of devices that the attackers could use, even sometimes specific for a specific victim, and they were exiting from systems in the same geographical location that you would expect your VPN client to be located in. So that's also, again, another demonstration of being stealthy in the environment, and they would blend into the normal traffic that you would observe in your environment. The other things we've talked about, remaining persistent across system upgrades, blending web shells, and then some cases reusing the credentials of valid administrators in the environment in the victim Windows domain, as an example. For credential access, obviously you have your VPN appliance authenticating your users, and this also provided the attackers with malware like SlowPulse or Bloodmine to collect those credentials and to reuse those in the environment, so they would no longer need to gather them within the victim environment itself. Or in some cases, when moving laterally, we've also seen the attackers reusing those same credentials being used against the cloud environment, right? If you have a hybrid network where you have both a on-site, on-premise network, they could also reuse those same credentials, some cases also multi-factor authenticated users, and target the cloud environment, any resources that you have over there. All right, so kind of to summarize, I mean, these VPN device appliances is something that we assess to be quite impactful to an organization. So how do you protect yourself? How do you defend yourself against this? And if it would happen, how do you recover from this? So first of all, as we've shown, is that these VPN appliance compromises, there's a number of CVEs associated to that allows that initial foothold within onto a VPN appliance. So as soon as there is a patch made available, although that there are 0 days possible, as we've shown, it really remains very important to patch very aggressively. Now, that may sound to you as security professionals as something obvious to do, but certainly in the case of these devices being highly used by teleworkers, that's something not as obvious to many organizations, because obviously patching these devices would often result in downtime. So it's kind of to be prepared for this with high available solutions that you can use to redirect your users. Other tips and tricks, if possible, use a reverse proxy or web application firewall, certainly if you're using a SSL VPN device, but of course that's going to increase the cost and complexity of the solution itself. And mostly also, prepare for something like this, right? We've seen organizations that are very familiar with performing investigations on Windows-based or Linux-based systems, but as soon as you are facing something like a VPN device compromise, it was often the first time that an organization had to deal with something like this. As I've mentioned, in the specific case we've talked about here is that the attackers were very well aware about the logging possibilities of the systems and how to bypass or make it harder to recover those traces. So storing data off the box itself is quite important. And so adding that to your equation, that a VPN device compromise can happen, as we've shown over here, and making sure that your environment is investigation friendly to allow those log sources to be available in case it would happen. And lastly, of course, if you are faced with a VPN appliance compromise, that you think holistically, right? You had an attacker that had access to a VPN appliance for perhaps number of weeks, perhaps months. What are the accounts that you need to reset? The accounts that are being used during that time by your users, but also the accounts stored on the VPN appliance itself. It uses to perhaps authenticate to Active Directory or a radio server or a multi-factor authentication server. All right, so kind of the bottom line, the 4 things that I want you to remember from this session is the VPN appliances itself are valuable pivot points into an environment. So be prepared for this. So therefore, increase your monitoring for these kind of hopefully black swan events that would happen to your organization. But if they do happen, have a response plan ready to take this into account. Whether we will see more of this in the future, we actually don't know. We also have trends like cloud computing being introduced, and things like zero trust, which make it less valuable to have these VPN devices into compromises for an attacker. But bottom line is that, still, if you're using this VPN technology, certainly be prepared for something like this, and exercise a incident response and a forensics forensic analysis before it actually would happen to your organization. So with this, if you have any questions, happy to answer them in any of your, so throw them into the chat and I'll happily respond to them.